Welcome to our seminar brought to you by the Division of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. We're very fortunate today to have Professor Lehana Thabane here with us. He's giving another module in our MSc in Biostatistics this week. And while he's here, he thought he would share with you this interesting presentation. So Prof. Thabane doesn't need much introduction. I'm sure most of you know who he is and where he comes from and that sort of thing. But just basically, Prof. Thabane is from Canada, McMaster University, where he is the Vice President of Research at St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton and the Scientific Director of the Research Institute at St. Joseph's Healthcare, and a Professor of Biostatistics in the Department of Health Research, Methods, Evidence and Impact at McMaster University. And he recently received an honorary doctorate from Stellenbosch University. He's very much involved in teaching and mentoring of our students and collaborating in a lot of research that goes on here in Stellenbosch University, UCT, and all over South Africa. So without further ado, I present Professor Thabane.
All right. That's a very generous introduction. I often just introduce myself. I'm just a biostatistician. All right. Let's see whether this will work. Does that work? Good. Now, there are people online, am I correct? So I have to stay here for them to see, or do I can move around? They can see the screen. Can we check whether they can see the screen? Is there a way to check? Ask them.
And you guys let us know if you can see the screen.
Yeah, we can see.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put the camera on.
All right, that's fantastic. This is home. It does feel like home. It's been many years since I've been coming to Stellenbosch. The first invitation was probably 2015 or 2014, maybe 2015, by Jimmy Volmink, a great friend and colleague. And I think I've been coming here for almost every year since then, until COVID disrupted those visits. And it always feels like I'm coming home. I've always been accepted by colleagues here with open arms. And I'm always grateful for the reception. And I've had the privilege of also working and collaborating with colleagues here, Tonya being one of them, and one of my favorite persons who I've never met in person, Fahima, who is also here. And I've had a student who is also finishing his PhD. So, I mean, it's been a great ride in many ways. I don't know whether Taryn is going to come. Taryn has been a great friend for many years. We've collaborated on several things, and so is Peter Nyasulu. Right? So it does feel like coming home. All right, now, could I kindly ask people online if you could all mute yourself? That would be very helpful. So I'm going to talk to you today about perhaps what other people make a living on, which is statistical significance. By the way, as statisticians, I'm also trying to think about whether this is a good idea for me to talk about this, because I'm suggesting we should get rid of statisticians, perhaps in what they do, which is how people make sense of statistical significance. Now, I'll talk to you about why this has come back for discussion. All right, now I don't know what to do. Let me see. Now, let me first disclose that I don't have any conflicts of interest, but surprisingly, as a professor, I get credit for giving presentations like this, which one could argue is conflict. Remember this article from Nature? That was before COVID, 2019. And about 800 individuals have signed on to retire statistical significance, which scared the hell out of statisticians in some areas. But I'll come back to that. So what do I plan to talk to you about today? The connection between statistical thinking and evidence-based practice. And a little bit of history for those of you who may not know about the history of statistical significance, where it came from, what the challenges are with statistical significance as we practice it today, and talk about the ongoing debate about what to do with it, and perhaps some suggestions about how to address some of the concerns that people have had with statistical significance, and ultimately why all of you should care about this topic or these issues as scientists. This is George Wells. Some people think of him as the father of fiction, science fiction. He was an Englishman, and he was a novelist and a journalist. But in statistics, we know him as someone who made one of the most audacious predictions that statistical thinking will someday be as necessary for efficient citizenship as the ability to read and write. We all know that being able to read and write is one of the most fundamental capacities or capabilities we expect of all our citizens, which is why in most countries, actually elementary education is free to allow everybody to be able to read and write. And what is statistical thinking when it comes to this issue, or what was he talking about when he talked about statistical thinking? Quite often when we see information or evidence, we can describe what we see, whether it's in the form of a graph, in the form of descriptive statistics. We can certainly describe that, and we can wonder about the mechanisms that generated the information or the evidence, and perhaps worry about the sources and the like. And then we also worry about, could there be other explanations for this evidence or this information? Should there be other things I need to worry about in terms of potential biases of that information and the like? And we often benchmark that information with what we would expect if it came from a particular source or mechanism. And this is really how we consume information in general. And in fact, statistical thinking in this context, when you think about it, is about advancing the welfare of society, but through research. And certainly the goal is very simple. Use that information to be able to either help with diagnosis, treatment, management of some condition, no matter what it is. So if you think about statistical thinking from that angle, it is really nothing else but evidence-based thinking, because it's about using information to make optimal decisions and thinking about the sources. There comes COVID. And now statistical thinking indeed became evidence-based thinking and a necessary way to actually protect ourselves from the virus. In that people remember the graphs like this on TV about people behaving or being asked to behave in a particular way to be able to flatten the curve, bending the curve. We saw pictures like this, people being advised, please wear your mask. This is what happens when you don't wear your mask. Even when you're walking past somebody else, you could be spitting all the virus all over them. So the idea was to get everybody to understand what happens when you wear a mask and what happens when you don't wear a mask. And these pictures were all over the internet. And suddenly understanding statistics became a necessary step for us to be able to protect ourselves from the virus. But we cannot really appreciate the clinical relevance of any evidence or information unless we adopt statistical thinking in how we actually generate, synthesize, or even interpret that evidence. I would argue first that in most clinical settings or most areas where we actually apply information, we need pragmatic evidence, trial evidence, to be able to do that. There are several areas where people practice, but the information they're using is not really based on what happens in those routine settings. So pragmatic evidence is actually needed. But there are barriers that I will also argue that have become difficult for us to be able to actually make optimal use of any information or evidence in real practice. And some of those have to do with reporting of these issues where people really don't report all the studies. That's a problem. And those who do, they also engage in behaviors that are not helpful, spin being one of them. In other words, trying to make things appear much more, better than they really are, which really creates problems. And we'll see how statistical significance plays a role in the spin problems as well. Now, let me stop back a little bit and take you back to the beginnings of statistical significance or p-value threshold as we know them. This is R.A. Fisher. Some people think of Fisher as really the father of modern statistics. And one time he was described as a genius who almost single-handedly created the foundations of modern statistical science. Now, for those of you who may not know a little bit of history about statistics, really many of the people who are the founding fathers of the discipline were not statisticians. This is Reverend Thomas Bayes. We have the whole field of Bayesian statistics named after him. He was a pastor by profession, and statistics was just a hobby for him, right? This is Fisher. Fisher was not a statistician. He was a geneticist, but statistics was a tool for him to be able to address all his genetics problems. And this was one of his mentors, Carl Pearson. He was a lawyer and a mathematician, but many of the tools we rely on in statistics were actually founded by these people. So just keep in mind that many of the people who were really the founding fathers of the discipline were not statisticians themselves. In other words, if you're not a statistician, guess what? You're a statistician in the making, right? So who was R.A. Fisher? He was born in England, moved to Australia, and he was motivated by many other people who influenced his work, Carl Pearson being one of them. Perhaps one of the best things that Fisher did was write a book which he called Statistical Methods for Research Workers. And in that book, he actually then introduced the concept of statistical significance. When he wrote about it, he said the value for which p is equal to 0.05 or 1 in 20 is nearly 2. It is convenient to make this point as a limit in judging whether a deviation is to be considered significant or not. But he continued in writing about this, that yes, this can be used as a standard level for concluding that there's evidence against a hypothesis being tested, though not as an absolute rule. When people read about Fisher introducing statistical significance, they forgot that he also provided a warning that this should not be used as an absolute rule. In fact, if you actually read very closely what Fisher wrote when he introduced the concept of statistical deviation, he said if p is between 0.1 and 0.9, there's certainly no reason to suspect the hypothesis being tested. If it's below 0.02, it is strongly indicated that the hypothesis fails to account for the whole of the facts. We shall not often be astray if we draw a conventional line at 0.05. He used the entire spectrum between 0 and 1 to provide guidance about how people could actually interpret what p-value is telling them about the evidence. The alpha of 0.05, because of that being considered the conventional, or he at least used the word conventional, was then introduced in statistical science as a criterion for judging statistical significance. This has pretty much become ritualistic, right? People are taught about this, people practice its use without even thinking what it means. It's just an accepted thing, and if you don't use it, it's like, why are you using something different? Why not 0.05, right? Now, this is Stuart Pocock, and one of the famous statisticians in the UK. He actually won that called the accept reject philosophy of statistical significance based on the magical 0.05 barrier remains dominant in the minds of many non-statisticians, right? I suggest that the blame doesn't go to non-statisticians alone. In fact, it goes to statisticians alike, because non-statisticians are taught and work with statisticians, right? So they can't be the ones to take the blame on how the practice is happening today. So you might wonder, what are the problems with statistical significance? What's the problem? First, an overwhelming number of published research, more than 90%, report p-values of 0.05 or less, okay? And John Ioannidis, one of the people who's dedicated his efforts in trying to improve how we do science, have warned people that all these papers that are published with significant findings, many of them really show that these reports could actually highlight the false positive results, right? But still, you wonder, how could it happen that 90% of published results are significant? It just seems impossible, right? Second, lack of statistical significance is often interpreted as absence of evidence. This is Doug Altman with his colleague, Martin Bland, and they've always actually warned people that absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, right? Why? Because many underpowered studies would often yield results that are not statistically significant, but that does not mean they're not clinically important. Okay? Let me give you an example. Here is a study that was actually looking at a combination of two drugs, and the idea was to see whether continuing that combination versus discontinuing the combination will lead to more harm than good, or more good than harm. And the result was not statistically significant with a p-value of 0.16, but you look at the effect estimate, it's about 60%, which is 40% reduction. So one would say about 41% relative risk reduction seems high, but you really won't be able to appreciate its clinical utility unless you express it as in absolute terms, which is risk difference of about 8%. And one would argue that this is clinically important. However, you're not able to see statistical significance of this finding because the sample sizes are too small. And therefore, you don't have enough of events to be able to see statistical significance. Now, this is a problem only if it's a very, very common issue in clinical research. So you might want to ask yourself, how common are results that are not statistically significant, but are clinically important in research? This was a study trying to answer this question in cardiology. They looked at all published trials they could find, and then they were trying to determine whether many of these that were not statistically significant, would they still have results that are clinically important or clinically relevant? They found 127 cardiovascular trials, and 92 of those trials were not statistically significant. So remember 92. 56, that's 61% of those 92, show that they had results that, even though not statistically significant, they were clinically relevant in the sense that the lower bound of the confidence interval would be considered clinically important. All right. In other words, having results that are not statistically significant but clinically important is incredibly highly prevalent. Cardiovascular trials is not the only area where this happens. I have seen it happen in critical care trials. I've seen it happen in orthopedic trials, and I've seen it happen in many other areas where I've worked. If you look into your own area of clinical practice, you'll actually find this is really not that uncommon. It's very common. And as you can see, it has a problem. That's why most reporting guidelines actually are trying to encourage people to think about how can I actually imagine or determine how much information I need before I do a study in order to rule out the prospect of getting a result that is not statistically significant, even though it's clinically important. If you look at the SPIRIT guideline, it has an item upon the sample size. If you look at all the other reporting guidelines, they have information about how much information was determined from the beginning of the study to rule out missing an important clinical effect. In short, p-values from underpowered trials are difficult to interpret. A common mistake is that when the result is not statistically significant, most people will say, oh, it's a negative trial or it's a negative study. What I'm warning you is that unless you can guarantee that the study was appropriately powered, a result that is not statistically significant does not necessarily mean the study is negative. It means you probably have a false negative. Okay. This is Tom Fleming, one of great colleagues and friends from University of Seattle, and often warns people that p-values are not easy to interpret without understanding the sampling context. That's why it's important when you're designing studies to have the right team to help you make sure that the sampling context is done. The third problem we face is even if you move to the other side and get as much sample size as you can possibly get, you could get an overpowered study and get a result that is statistically significant, but it's not clinically important. Here's another example of a study where if you look at the number needed to treat is 48, average relative risk reduction is about 2%. And people could argue that, well, while this may seem like on a relative scale, it's about 17% relative reduction, it looks big. But if you really want to understand the clinical importance of any effect, you have to do it on the absolute scale. It's about 2.1%, which others would argue that it's not that clinically important. The reason why you have a very, very small p-value is because the sample size is too large. You want to get statistical significance, just take a very large sample size. You'll get it, guaranteed. The fourth problem we face is statistical significance show that many trials in clinical areas are very fragile. This is now one of my colleagues, Michael Walsh. He was one of my trainees many years ago, and he introduced the concept of clinical trial fragility. What does that mean? You have a trial for which you're trying to compare two treatments, A and B, and you are assessing their comparison on the basis of the relative number of events between the two treatments. And if you find using the Fisher statistic that the difference between them is statistically significant, you now think about moving the number of events from no event to event until you reverse the statistical significance, right? In the treatment of interest, I'm moving patients from no event to event until the statistical significance that you saw become reversed. Now, as you can imagine, the fewer patients it takes to reverse statistical significance, the more fragile the trial will be. If it takes a high number of patients to reverse statistical significance, we say such a trial is less fragile. So Michael looked at this issue, and then people started applying this concept of clinical trial fragility in various areas. This was in anesthesiology trials. This was in orthopedic trials, spine surgery, emergency medicine, stroke. This one is stroke. This was ophthalmology. And they all show that the trials in these areas are incredibly fragile. In fact, this was one of my students who looked at all reviews looking at fragility of trials in clinical areas. The average is 4. It takes 4 patients to reverse statistical significance. Now, think about it. The way we practice medicine, it's simple. We generate evidence on one patient. We do it in several patients. We call that a study. We know that is not good enough. We then replicate that study in several settings. We have a collection of studies. We synthesize that evidence, we appraise it, and then we have a guideline based on appraised evidence from different studies. We call that a replication. Now, imagine a guideline that is based on evidence that shows it only takes 4 patients to reverse statistical significance. How reliable is that evidence, right? Here's another problem. How many people here have taken a course in basic statistics? Raise your hand if you have. I also did it. And I also taught people in basic statistics. And I found that people find it hard to understand p-values. They simply misinterpret them, right? These are statements I've seen people write about what p-value really means. It means there's no effect. The effectiveness of one treatment is not different from the other one, and so on. All the statements are statements showing that people are having a hard time to interpret a p-value. Despite this difficulty, we keep on relying on a measure that most people find very difficult to interpret because it's not intuitive, right? The sixth problem we have is what we call p-hacking, right? And there's evidence showing that p-hacking is common in practice, particularly in medical fields, right? So you might wonder, what is p-hacking? It's when we collect data or evidence, we select data or we select evidence, perform statistical analysis until a result that is not significant becomes significant. There's many ways you can do this. Collect more data until you get significance. Collect and analyze lots of data, but report only the ones that are significant. Select variables until you get significance. Exclude patients until you get significance. By the way, if none of these things really work, hire Tanya, she's a statistician, to transform the data for you until you get significance, right? The unfortunate consequences of all these practices is that it makes it incredibly difficult for us to replicate what other people have done. The reason being, people who engage in these things, they're never transparent about what they did. No wonder why it's difficult to replicate what they did, because you think they provided all the information, but they never provide information about the p-hacking aspects of it. So we now cannot replicate the evidence they have seen in their study. Now, how many people follow Retraction Watch? If you look at Retraction Watch, you'll actually find the majority or most of the studies that are retracted are a result of people falsifying things, fabricating things. Why? Because they want to get statistical significance. It's very, very rare that you'll find a retracted paper that did not show a significant result, right? So this is actually propelling bad behavior among scientists. The desire for them to get something that is significant, and their institutions and the media and the press and the rest of the world will be glorifying them for finding something significant. This was on the rise during COVID. Everybody wanted to be the one to find the cure, right? More retractions happened during COVID as a result of it. Now, those of you who do evidence synthesis, you probably heard of publication bias. This is a result where studies that are not showing statistical significance are not being published, simply because editors, reviewers reject them. So there's a propensity of studies that show statistical significance to be published. That's why John Ioannidis actually found that it's about 90% of them that are significant. What happened to the others? So the concept of publication bias exists only because of statistical significance problem. If we didn't have that, perhaps we didn't have the problem. Now, this was a study looking at systematic reviews in Cochrane, looking at the publication bias. And it actually showed that there's evidence of publication bias in Cochrane systematic reviews. Now, those of you who do evidence synthesis, you know that the Cochrane is the highest standard that we use for systematic review of the evidence and synthesis. Now, you can imagine if we can't trust Cochrane reviews because of publication bias, what more of the other reviews, right? We create evidence-based guidelines based on a systematic review of the evidence, appraisal of that evidence, grading that evidence, and then having a group of colleagues to look at that evidence to create a guideline. And if publication bias is a problem, so you can imagine how good will be those guidelines based on that type of evidence. Significant findings tend to be overrepresented in abstracts. and press releases, right? It would be a miracle if you find somebody on TV talking about some fantastic finding from their study and it was not significant. Almost all the time, it will be because they found something significant. And I'm talking about statistical significant, not clinical significant, right? And this is because of the problem that media, the press, the institutions, everybody is running after statistical significance for public glory. We call that spin. And I'll show you with an example of how dangerous this can be. That even if the primary outcome is not significant, they find significant on a secondary outcome or whatever you call it, tertiary outcome, you would often find that there's not much said about the outcome that's primary and not significant. They focus on the one where the statistical significance. Even I actually failed to convince my colleagues that's bad practice, right? They tell me, they're not going to publish it if you don't do that, right? So this is a problem, and it definitely exists. There's a Frank Harrell. It's another colleague in the US. He has a long list of the problems with p-values, right? Including how difficult they are to interpret, to calculate, and all sorts of stuff. So if you really want to have a whole list of all the problems, I encourage you to have a look at his website. P-value has lots of problems. Too many for me to articulate in the very small time that we have. So what I'm going to do is now talk about the ongoing debate about statistical significance, right? This was 2016. The American Statistical Association is perhaps one of the most prominent statistical association around the world. They try to really not only take care of their members, but they try to change how statistics are practiced, not only in the US, but around the world. In 2016, they put together a group of colleagues to look at this issue and came up with a warning against misuse of statistical significance. And they had a statement, and that statement had 6 principles with it. First, they warn people that p-values, they only indicate how compatible the data are with a hypothesis. Look at that. Only indicate compatibility of the data with the hypothesis. They do not measure the probability that the hypothesis is true. They should not be used on whether the p-value is low or above some threshold. They're discouraging that. If anything, they're encouraging people to report everything, not just p-values. Certainly not whether p-value is above or below some threshold. And they remind people that p-value does not measure the size of the effect. And it does not provide a good measure of evidence. That's what the 6 principles in the statement. Well, that was 2016. 2018, the debate continued. Some people said, well, that statement did not change practice. I thought 2 years was too quick to see practice change. And this group of people then said, no, actually, we should actually lower the threshold to make it harder for people to achieve statistical significance. So let's move it from 0.05 to 0.005, right? And as this was coming out, John Ioannidis actually wrote an editorial for JAMA about this issue. JAMA is the Journal of the American Medical Association, right? And by the way, while he was writing that article, somebody was already on it looking at the simulation to see the impact of the suggestion. And actually she was, oh yes, this may not be the solution. Why? Because while it will reduce the risk of false positives, it increases the risk of overestimation of treatment effects. So definitely lowering the threshold was not going to help, right? So now we're in 2019. the American Statistical Association brought together another group of people to say, hey, we still have to figure out how to do this. They actually dedicated one of their prominent journals to this issue, right? And over 40 statisticians said, well, we should disallow the term statistical significance. So I ask people here, raise your hand if in your scientific writing, you will never say something is statistical significant. Nobody? You're not alone. Before COVID, when I gave this talk and I asked people the same thing, it was a room full of people. Nobody raised their hand. By the way, of the 800 people who sign on retiring statistical significance, many of them are still using the term statistical significance in their writing. So I know some of them. So the American Statistical Association dedicated this to what they call statistical significance in the 21st century, a world beyond p less than 0.05. And in the editorial, the editor said, well, we caution people they should stop saying something is statistically significant. Get rid of that kind of language in your writing. None of you raised your hands that you'll stop doing it. So I guess you guys are among the stubborn ones. Now, the number of people signing on to this, it's getting bigger. Now it's 800 people saying, let's retire statistics. Did anybody here sign on to this? No? South Africa was not represented. All right, so this came out. And when it came out, there was a lot of coverage about it, editorial after editorial by different professional organizations, generated a lot of debates on both sides. And some hailed it as a sensible and practical thing to do. Others pushed back. And John Ioannidis was one of them who said, hang on a minute. If we get rid of statistical significance, we give him bias a free pass. Why? Because when somebody says something is statistically significant, we scrutinize it. We look at the methods, and then we can see whether was the methodology sound enough for us to believe this. Okay. Now, if we are not going to even see statistical significance, we may not put the same scrutiny. That's what you were saying. So we shouldn't get rid of it because now we give him bias a free pass. This is Colin Beck, who is the editor of our journal for the Society for Clinical Trials. He said, the problem is not statistical significance, it's human behavior, right? With institutions really propelling this behavior because of institutional policies that promote bad practices among scientists, putting a lot of pressure on people's promotion and all that stuff. And of course, the press and everybody else who are not helping. To be honest, I thought it was quite unlikely that practice will change anytime soon. In fact, I asked you guys to raise your hand if you want to change. None of you are willing to change, right? Well, guess what? As this debate is going, some people are actually trying to do something about it. So here's a journal that says, that's it, we're banning p-values, right? But it turned out that there's evidence that if you ban p-values, people will find something else to abuse, right? So this was showing that banning p-values was not going to be a solution because people find them. Oh, I was sorry. The New England Journal of Medicine said, we are changing our policies as a result of the ongoing debate on statistical significance. And therefore, we will no longer be looking. Then I said, okay, let me look at the change. The only significant change I could see was that they were saying people should replace p-values with confidence intervals when neither the protocol nor the statistical analysis plan included adjustments for multiple testing. We already knew that. So it didn't seem like much of a practice change as far as I'm concerned. To be honest, I think the real change will, if you and I are willing to overhaul our academic systems, the way we train people, the way institutions have policies to promote professors. Otherwise, it's quite unlikely for practice to actually change. Now, in fact, Colin, I repeat his message that p-values are not the problem. Human behavior and policies that do not align with good practices that advance science is a problem, right? So we have to figure out how to change that part. But for the time being, some have made some recommendations, suggestions about how to deal with this. The first one was an attempt to encourage people to be transparent when they report science. When evidence-based medicine was becoming prevalent, in 1996, the first sponsored statement was published. The idea was to encourage people who are doing clinical trials to report clinical trials or the same information so that it makes it easier to synthesize that information to inform a guideline. They realized that trials were not doing that. So the council statement was an attempt to get people to report the same information to make it easier to synthesize the evidence to be able to actually inform a guideline. The council statement was updated in I think it was 2001, and the latest update was in 2010. We are currently updating it again. So I'm part of the group that's updating again. And if you look at the council statement, it doesn't in any way encourage reporting p-values. It talks about reporting estimates with confidence intervals. Nowhere does it mention reporting p-values, right? If you look at all the extensions, none of the extensions encourage reporting p-values. We did it for pilot and feasibility trials with colleagues in the UK. In fact, in the extension to pilot trials, we deliberately discourage reporting of p-values. Why? Because pilot and feasibility studies are studies that are not intended to assess statistical significance of effects. They are assessing whether main trials would be feasible. So doing p-values would be misguided in that case because it is not about statistical significance. Rather, we encourage people to provide estimates or preliminary estimates of those effects with confidence intervals, which we think will be much more helpful. Others have encouraged focusing on clinical relevance instead of p-values and clinical importance judged on the basis of where the result is relative to the minimum important difference. When we design studies, we often think about what would be the minimum important difference that we should be targeting that will help us to say we have been successful, right? But when we have the results, people don't go back to interpret that result relative to that minimum clinically important difference. What this approach is encouraging is that always go back to see where the minimum important difference is based on your results, and you can determine whether it's definite, probable, possible, and so on. Tanya is currently looking at the evidence to see, do people really do this? And how many trials actually would have definite, probable, and so on, depending on where their minimum clinically important difference is. Because this issue of better practices using p-value is still not resolved yet. Right? Now, let me remind you again that the concept of minimum clinically important difference also came from McMaster. These are the colleagues who looked at it. At the top is Roman, and then we have Joel, and at the bottom is Gordon Guyatt. Gordon Guyatt is the guy who came up with the term evidence-based medicine. He was trying to describe what David Sackett had been doing since the 60s. And Gordon was the guy who said, whatever David has been preaching and teaching people was about how to actually use evidence to make better decisions in medicine. And he called it evidence-based medicine. Others said abandon p-values or p-value threshold or the use of statistical significance. In fact, in the editorial that John Ioannidis wrote for JAMA, he actually came up with more suggestions. He said, well, we could lower the p-value. Remember, I told you that lowering the p-value is not going to help. He said abandon p-value threshold. In other words, just report the p-value instead of saying it's below or above some threshold. Or abandon p-values entirely, use alternative inferences, focus on estimates and confidence intervals. And if none of these things work, really take people back to school and retrain them. Who wants to go back and redo a PhD or master's? I don't think any of us want to, right? Others said, instead, focus on clinical relevance, focusing on other dimensions of importance. Patient importance, that's another concept that people should say, we should be focusing on what's important to patients rather than statistical significance. Person significance, patient-centeredness. In Canada, we have the so-called patient orientation. I'm part of a group that's trying to actually refresh a strategy for patient-oriented research. And then Peter, as a colleague in the UK, said, maybe we should focus on what he called humanly important difference. And if you want to learn more about it, you can read in this book. My final thoughts to you is that statistical thinking is really about evidence-based thinking to some extent. We don't need statistical significance to think statistically, right? However, one would argue that we need clinical relevance to be evidence-based. What's the importance of actually having statistically significant studies with large sample size pulled together, which really may not actually give you information that's clinically helpful to your patients? Ideally, we don't want to be in this quadrant where there's no statistical significance, it's not even clinically important. If it's clinically important but not statistical significant, perhaps it's not that bad. Here, statistical significant, but may not necessarily be clinical relevant. You want to be in that quadrant, but how often does this happen? It's really not that often. In fact, that's part of actually what Tanya's looking at. How often do we find studies in that top quadrant? Honestly, I think we should re-emphasize education. That's what I think is our best bet. Instead of actually focusing on statistics, we should shift away from this binary thinking. And we educate people on critical thinking, statistical thinking as a concept, and the basic epidemiology concepts, fundamental research methods, reporting of research, peer review process. Many people who are peer reviewers for journals, they're not even trained on how to do that well. Just because somebody has a PhD doesn't mean they're going to be a good reviewer, right? We need to educate. In fact, that includes editors. Many people who are editors are not trained in how to do a good job with peer reviewing things, let alone being an editor. We should always have balanced interpretation of findings from studies. We are human beings and nothing that we do is free of errors, including interpretation of studies. We should educate people about evidence-based practices. Not just doctors, even non-clinicians need to understand the principles of evidence-based medicine so they can see when things are not going well. We should certainly do a much better job educating our colleagues who work in the press. Now, who should we educate? Journal editors and reviewers, the lay people, so they can figure out when we are actually trying to mislead them with our spins and so on. All researchers, care providers, which are people who, when they are actually reading evidence synthesis, all they're looking for is significance. They think, oh, it's significant, it must be good for my patients, right? We should educate them to challenge anything that says something is significant before they adopt it. The public, academic administrators, to be honest, many of the policies that govern how we actually practice education in academic institutions need to change. How we promote people, how we incentivize productivity.
Agreed.
Right.
Hallelujah.
Somebody saying hallelujah. We also need to actually educate people who provide the funding. Because if the funders, who are the people who support the resources for us to do studies, actually require that we practice research much better, this might actually help to some extent. Now, all this debate is going on. Others are saying abandon this, abandon that. And the American Statistical Association actually came back and said, hey, our policy with the 6 statements and so on, and people being encouraged to stop saying statistical significant, did not mean they were encouraging people to abandon p-values. So they came out to clarify their stand that we're not saying people should abandon p-values. Which was encouraging. But what I want to end it with is to actually show you that misguided focus on statistical significance can have dangerous consequences at the population level, right? People remember this controversy that the vaccine for measles is seen or known as associated with development of autism among children. Remember that story? Now, that's where the headlines in Canada before COVID, just before COVID, in 2019, measles was spreading in Canada, right? How did this controversy start? In 2019, 1998. 1998 was a paper published in the Lancet, one of the top medical journals. And the paper, if you look for it online, you'll see a copy of it with red mark in the middle of it, retracted, okay? And I'll come to why this paper was one of the dangerous things that ever happened. So what was the controversy? It claimed that, this study actually claimed that there was a causal link between receiving the vaccine for measles and development of autism, right? Those people who don't know what autism is, children having difficulty with the world around them in terms of communication and so on, and how they relate to other people with very inflexible behaviors. However, there was evidence after evidence showing that exposure to the vaccine was not associated with this, but autism. Despite all that, let's look at all the study said. So there were 12 patients in that study. And the controls in the study, this was not a randomized control trial. There was a selection of controls, almost seeming like deliberately done to prove the hypothesis. Okay. There were other serious things, and of course the conclusions were speculative, not supported by the evidence, at least presented in the paper. But I would argue that from my point of view, the greatest harm was done by reporting of a p-value of the test of association between the vaccine and what they called an outcome, which was levels of acid. And I'll talk about why that levels of acid was also misguided use or choice for an outcome. This is the graph that was presented in the paper. On the left, you have the 12 patients in the study. On the right, you have the 12 controls. Look at how close the controls are, right? And then you have the p-value, the test of significance between them. And they're using what they call urinary thermonic acid. Now, for those of you who are medical doctors, you probably know that, lower levels of B12 could also be associated with this acid, right? And may have nothing to do with whether you have autism or not. There's no evidence to show that this is a surrogate marker of autism. Okay. Now, what happens if you go in the abstract? What do you see? A significant p-value. You don't have the measure of association. You don't have the confidence interval of association. All you have is a p-value showing the statistical significance between the two. Unfortunately, the seeds of confusion and doubt had already been sown. This is the situation in England following the paper. Look at the rates of vaccine coverage in England until 1998, when they started falling when the study was published. right? And they started falling until they were way below, in many ways, 80%, right? Even when the paper was retracted, it took time for it to come back. Fast forward to 2019, this was US. And in the US, they were actually counting cases of missiles, right? This was 2019, there were about 1282 cases of missiles, and the situation seemed to be getting worse, that there were more missiles. And the reason this was happening is because the anti-vaccine movement is much, much stronger today. Nobody ever thought there would be in an era where the social media and misinformation can spread so quickly, and parents are refusing to vaccinate their children, right? So cases were increasing, but if you think the situation in the US is bad, across the Atlantic was worse. This is the DRC. It was catastrophic. I don't think anybody was paying attention. WHO was trying to warn people that the situation with deaths due to missiles in the DRC was getting worse. And he said it was spread. Now we're talking about deaths, not cases. In the US, we're talking about cases, not deaths, right? Now, for you to have a better sense, remember the deaths due to Ebola? We had more deaths due to missiles for children in the DRC than Ebola had done, right? Now, this was 2020. It was now 6,000 deaths. Now, please bear with me. The situation in the DRC was caused by lack of resources. I am not suggesting that people was to blame. They just didn't have enough resources to be able to deal with this and access to care. What I'm saying is, in the West, a lot of what's happened with missiles being on the rise, actually it's back on the rise in Europe too, is because of misinformation. Based on a study that was debunked and retracted, but the damage is already done, and we're spending a lot of resources fighting misinformation about the vaccine, while we could be using those resources to help countries like the DRC. So I just think the use of the resources to be fighting misinformation is unfortunate, right? Now, the CBC, this is Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. They had a story about anti-vaccine just before COVID. And I was actually shocked because one of the darling supporters of this anti-vaccine movement is Wakefield. The guy whose study was actually retracted. So you can see how once the damage is done with social media today, it becomes incredibly difficult to actually correct this. So I guess we have a lot of work to do. Now, whatever I've shared with you, this comes in this paper, and I encourage you to have a look at the paper because perhaps it might do a much better job than what I've done. But honestly, what I'm trying to say is, I don't think getting rid of statistical significance is going to help. Doesn't surprise me that people are advocating it. Others say we should focus on all these other dimensions and so on. I think we should be redoubling our efforts to actually educate people and do the best we can with trying to actually warn people about the dangers, including administrators at universities in terms of the policies they put together. If you want to have a look at YouTube video for this presentation, which I gave in the past, is also available. And I'll stop here and say thank you.
Thanks very much, Prof. Thabane, for that very interesting and very, very important topic that you highlighted. We have time for some questions, so I'll check if there's questions online, but in the meantime, if you have a question or a comment, please just raise your hand. Yes.
Thank you for the task presentation. So I'm in basic sciences and in cardiovascular basic science. But oftentimes in cell culture we see the same thing when Western blotting or your basic science techniques. So a lot of what you presented today is obviously based on clinical trials and much larger studies. How much relevance do you think, this is the difficult version, how much relevance do you think p-value has in basic science where we already, and animal studies, where we're really very limited in the amount of sample that we've got available?
Oh my gosh. You know, what's your name? You know, what you're saying is true. It doesn't surprise us that when we move from basic science and we're trying to translate what we think we found in basic science into humans, it gets harder. A lot of phase 1 studies fail, a huge proportion of them. And part of it is because of that practice, where, you know, I showed a video yesterday in my class of somebody saying, you know, this is a basic science study, an in vitro study. We always use 3 patients. I just want you as a statistician to confirm that 3 is sufficient. And I have seen a situation where people get significance in basic science with 6 mice. And that they say, that's it. We found the magic bullet. We should now go on to the next phase of the study. So, I mean, it's a bit unfortunate. And part of it also is training. We need to do a much better job, not only talking about this issue to our clinical community, but to also our basic science colleagues. Everybody's trying to do the best they can, but people practice the only best way they know how. So I would encourage that, hey, it's your chance to go out and educate your colleagues and repeat this talk. I'll give you the talk, you can go give it to them and keep going around. I mean, that's how even clinical practice has changed, with someone coming up with a better way to practice and taking the time to spread the message around. Slowly, slowly, we might be able to actually help. Yes, that's a problem. Yes.
Maybe there are lots of things happening now. If the debate for Thabane is going on, there's also the issue of AI-driven methods, algorithmic kind of approaches to data analysis. And see, that's why they don't even care about this. But just your thoughts in terms of how this algorithm the machine learning kind of aspect of how they kind of improve the species, when it comes to the
It's true. All right. So I'll repeat the question for the sake of those people who are online. The issue is, what's my reflection on the role of AI and automated algorithms and how these issues relate to the issue we're talking about, which is p-values today, or statistical significance. And I mean, I would have so much to say about this issue. The first being, we all know that it doesn't really matter what you're doing. Garbage in science, garbage out. If you don't do a good job designing a study, determining what type of information you collect, how to guarantee that the methods you use are reliable and valid, the data you have is not in any way gonna compensate for all those deficiencies. So garbage in, garbage out. Part of the challenge with AI as currently conceived by some people, I'm not saying all people, right, is that there's so much data, most of which is not collected for research and therefore cannot be validated. The idea is to be able to mine this data and look for patterns or associations and so on. And the issue is, well, if you can't trust the data, how could you trust the results, no matter what algorithm you used? That's a potential problem, right? The second thing is, we already know from research in statistical science that automated algorithms in model selection or model building can lead to biased results. Now, how would AI be any different? So one still has to be able to then think, I mean, computers, when it comes to model building, cannot do better than a human being, because a human being, you have to think about the biological explanation of why you would expect a relationship between this variable and the outcome. The computer is not going to think about that. It's going to pick up anything it can find, associations with some of which will be true, some of which will be false positive, some of which will be missed out as false negative. So you run all sorts of errors with automated strategies, but it starts with the data. I would say AI mechanisms or algorithms have a potential and a role, but when it comes to data, we cannot replace good study designs with the hope that AI algorithms would actually compensate for all those deficiencies. That's about the two things I would say for now. There's certainly a lot more that we all still have to worry about when it comes to AI and data.
So we're not out of a job yet.
Oh, statisticians will live forever.
There's two hands up online. Sherwin, you can go ahead. Do you want to unmute yourself?
I'll unmute myself. Thank you very much, Prof. Thank you very much for the talk as well. I think it was very interesting. You know, coming from a background rather, you know, in medicine at the moment, we're doing a master's. Often we don't have a lot of time, you know, juggling work, juggling doing an MMed and everything else as well. But I think you raised a very good point about, you know, the p-value and looking at whether we should be using the term statistical significance or not as well. One of the biggest challenges I've had, particularly with my research at the moment, was actually, and it's something that you touched on just now with your last question, is actually designing a study very well and choosing the correct sample size. I think partly the issue that a lot of people have is that I don't think we often pay attention to our basics, particularly in stats. I mean, I'm no statistician, but I think just in terms of sample size, there's so many ways of actually calculating a sample size for a particular study and a particular design that I think there's more emphasis on, you know, sort of the bias towards proving a certain point in most instances. And I think looking for something that is truly statistically significant as well. One of the issues I've also had is that just in terms of determining a sample size as well, I think a lot of us actually, you know, battle to grasp the concept of, you know, selecting a study design that is appropriate and you know, making assumptions based on that and conclusions. And perhaps it doesn't need to be something that is huge and statistically, you know, something that we need to prove a point with in publishing big data. But I think the one thing that we forget often is that we can often just say, this is a pilot project. You know, what we found is, you know, this is significant and this is not. And whether there's an association that also needs to be tested, but also possibly then suggesting something a lot, sort of a larger study that needs to be done. And I think the one thing that I've had an issue with particularly is that I think we often, just in terms of sample size, base it on a previous study or somebody else's previous calculations without paying really much attention to correlation coefficients and calculating a sample size based on the strength of association between our you know, exposure and outcomes that we would, you know, sort of possibly testing as well, and whether there's a very strong association and what sample size we should be using for that association to actually measure whether there's something statistically significant that we can base treatments on as well. But yeah, it's more of a comment as well. But thank you very much for your talk as well.
Thank you, Sherwin. We're having a hard time hearing you, but if you want to have some continued discussions on any of the issues, please don't hesitate. I'll provide my email to Tanya and we can connect afterwards. Sorry, we're having a bit of a hard time hearing you. All right, somebody else online?
Yeah, Liska, if you could just talk up when you give us, if you have a specific question or something, because it's very soft this side. Sorry about that. Liz,
Hi,
can you go ahead? Hi.
I hope you can hear me. This was an incredibly important discussion. I think this should be made available to all our colleagues in medical sciences and the other sciences as well. But my comment and maybe a question is that listening to all the statistical thinking issues, I think what I've experienced is that there are significant barriers to statistical education in our medical faculty, where students and staff think statistics are very hard and they don't even try to understand it. And these students and staff become staff and researchers at the university and then lack the understanding of proper research design and even just interpreting the research that they do consume. That is my first important thing, is we should be focusing on early career researching and statistical understanding and basic knowledge, and just to demystify it, because it's not hard. We don't have to understand all the things. We just have to have a basic working knowledge with someone that can guide us in understanding these types of difficult concepts. The other thing that I think might be important to explore is data transparency. When we publish results, we need to also be transparent with the data so that peer reviewers might be able to look at data as well. And then improve data literacy, I think, because we can ban p-values and we can talk about only publishing effect sizes. But if our researchers and colleagues don't understand what you're meaning when you're saying that, that defeats the problem. So I think education and statistical education, starting from early career researchers, would be the only way forward.
Well, you know
Thanks,
what? I hear you. I say amen to that.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
But as Prof. Thabane said, it's going to take a long time for people to change the way of doing things, and for us to re-educate everybody. People have become very set in their ways.
Good. So
any other questions before we close? Okay. I just want to say thank you very much to Professor Thabane and hand him one of our exclusive T-shirts and mugs.
Thank you.
From our division has a stats club.
Thank you.
Be very nerdy.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and thank you to all of you for the honor to speak with you and share some thoughts with you.
Thanks very much. Thanks to all of you who came and watched this presentation, and to all of you online as well. Bye.